Start nu! Hello everybody. I hope everyone is having a great day so far. Today we're going to talk about our new solutions that we are implementing called security testing. We can start with a little bit about me. My name is Victor Olsen. I've currently worked at Onevinn for about 8 months, and I work primarily out of the Gothenburg office. I work both with blue team and red team, so my primary role during the day is including both sides of the spectrum, if we would say it like that. It kind of works together to give me the aspect of both working with our managed detection and response branch and working with the penetration tests and red teams engagements that we're conducting. Both of them, I think, create a perfect environment for me to implement what I learn on both sides. So it's kind of that purple team synergy. On my free time, I enjoy spending time with my family, primarily my dog. And then I also spend a lot of time tinkering with small electronics, and I am a big CTF enthusiast, so I love solving problems when it comes to IT security and offensive security, general stuff. Yeah, that's a little bit about me. So we'll get into the security services. The main point that we were trying to solve was to help enterprises preemptively identify vulnerabilities and security weaknesses and general oversights when it comes to how things are implemented, how we work with security tests in general. So we've come up with a few solutions that we believe in recent years have seen be a vital part of improving an organization's overall security posture. The first one that we're introducing is, of course, penetration tests. This can, of course, cover a bunch of different types where it comes to network testing, it comes to web application testing, host testing, and other things. We will get into what type of solutions or packages that we do offer and how we kind of conduct it and how we go about it. The next one is, of course, a little bit larger. It's the red team engagements, where it might be where you as a client might have an established blue team already or security procedures and might want to test those procedures. We have a common vulnerability assessment, whereby we conduct not just scanning, but there's also manual labor gone into it. So it's just not a plainly generated report, but we go into how we use tools to generate valuable reports to report on security weaknesses within your network applications or systems. Another one is, of course, training and education, where we conduct both. We offer both courses and we offer general presentation and education material. It comes with these services. We want to contribute to achieving a better overall organizational security posture. With penetration tests, we have our systematic security evaluations, which focuses on primarily systems, networks, or applications. And of course, the goal is to identify general weaknesses that we see or vulnerabilities that are prevalent in systems to further develop on a secure posture. It comes down to identifying where we see vulnerabilities and security weaknesses. But it also goes down to that penetration tests typically go beyond your typical scanning operations. Just scanning an application or a network will yield you some results. It will give you general vulnerability information if we look at scanning tools or vulnerability assessments tools like Nessus or Nmap. They often generate what you would call a summarized report that will give you some type of result, and then we can from there continue with manual testing. Beyond scanning is where this takes place, where the manual vulnerability work goes in, where we kind of look at misconfigurations and more kind of on the OWASP side, where we have frameworks to look at how we identify vulnerabilities manually. These can be more complex vulnerabilities that have been released like recently, and maybe they don't have proof of concept codes or something like that. In general, we have seen that there's a trend in cybersecurity to move left when it comes to incorporating security tests. When I talk about moving left, I talk about incorporating security tests earlier in a development pipeline. I believe that security testing procedures should be applied broadly along that scope. So I don't believe that particularly a security test fits better in pre-production than it fits in production. I rather think that we need to apply a test that is scalable and a test that is adaptable to these types of situations. So it's not just going towards pre-production or production or a certain point in development. When we look at web application pen testing, at its core, it's geared towards, as it says, web applications. And as all things penetration testing and auditing, it comes down to identifying vulnerabilities and security flaws that could be leveraged by an attacker. This is also important to bring up that penetration could serve multiple purposes. However, at which phase it is applied will yield different results. So if we're looking at introducing penetration tests and audits in production environments, it might have a larger scope than if we're looking at a pre-production system. If we have a production system that we think might be suffering from a new vulnerability, let's say if we look back a few weeks or months, we had the Log4j incident, where a lot of companies were unaware if they were affected by the Log4j vulnerability. A quick way of looking into this and assuring that we're probably not going to see an attack surface from this, or we're probably not going to see exploitation on our end from this, is by applying a penetration test that could look into if you're vulnerable to Log4j and how this could affect if you are, which is kind of the good thing about penetration tests, where it's not just identifying if you're vulnerable. It's also, okay, how are you vulnerable? What are the results of being vulnerable? How do we remediate? And what type of threat score do we see this vulnerability having? So the testing procedure when it comes to web application is not too in depth, but there's of course layers to it. We will start by just talking about kind of the baselines here. For testing, we're of course looking at vulnerabilities in general. When following what we call the OWASP standardized testing framework, it's kind of just keep testing procedures structured and thorough, looking at OWASP top 10, looking at general functionality and applications, right? So when we're talking about the OWASP framework, we're talking about looking at, for example, broken access control, cryptographic failures, injection vulnerabilities, security misconfigurations. There's a bunch of things that we can look into. So how do we do this? Well, at its core, we can look at, for example, a web application, and we can utilize just a browser, an intercept proxy, and then we intercept the traffic that goes between the web server and the browser. But this setup allows us to have complete control over the data that is sent between our browser and the web server. And you can imagine that once we have this type of control, we can manipulate values, we can test all types of data that perhaps the application did not think was possible or did not account for. So this can also result in some type of exploitation or vulnerability. This is something that most vulnerability scanners will not pick up. They will mostly pick up looking at, for example, known vulnerabilities in certain frameworks or libraries. When it comes to another type of penetration test, we have internal network testing. Internal testing really embodies the methodology of assume breach, which really is comes down to assuming that a cyber attack will happen, opposed to it might happen. This simple shift in mindset kind of transitions defense strategies from passive to an active stance, where we're actively trying to see, okay, what if an attacker has gained a foothold in our environment? What type of movement can the attacker do? What type of vulnerabilities are present for the attacker to exploit? So doing one of these engagements and placing an attacker in your network, seeing what type of vulnerabilities there are, if there are any devices that are vulnerable to something particular, and then if there is, let's say, some type of lateral movement within the environment, what data can we access? It relies heavily on verifying potential implications of existing vulnerabilities. So what type of implications can we get from having these type of vulnerabilities in our environment? When looking at external network testing, this is testing done outside of your local network. Let's say if we have a target, we would categorize it as maybe public domains or public IP addresses. You can think of your network, like your external network, as your organization's parameter. You can see that if we get the pointer, we can see that we count this as the parameter, and this is your local net. And because new vulnerabilities emerge every day, it's kind of important to know what type of information, what type of devices you expose to the internet. So it might be a good idea to have someone look at, okay, we have these devices that are accessible. What can we do? Can we manipulate some type of data on the web server? Can we do something to get initial foothold, right? Do we have some type of cameras that are exposed? Do we have any type of device that really is connected to the internet? When we're looking at the difference between external versus internal testing, we can see that there is just the attack vector aspect is quite different. The scope of looking at an external test and an internal one will vary in what type of targets we have. It is, of course, when doing an internal test, looking at just the local resources. We're not looking at the external parameter as much. We're looking at what can we possibly do from the inside. Let's say we have a guest network, right? I go into your lobby, I connect to that guest network. What can I reach from this position? Maybe we do another position, right? But the ground rule is that what resources can we access? Do these resources have, or these entities have vulnerabilities? What kind of precautions can these vulnerabilities have for our organization? When it comes to an external attacker, it's interesting because you can start to see that from an external attacker's point of view, the whole point of attacking an organization is getting on the inside, most likely. So you often see movement from an external attacker to an internal. So that's kind of your first line of defense, your external parameters. So when we look at how we execute and how we deliver our penetration tests in general, we of course start with planning meetings where goals are identified and means to reach set goals are established. We have scoping meetings. We look at, okay, what do you want to have tested? Is there a concrete area of operations? Do we have set IP ranges and domains, for example? We have update meetings. This is a critical part of receiving good value for the job that is actually done, the engagement that is conducted. We need to have meetings that are set down maybe perhaps once a week where we look at this is what on our end, what we have seen, what we have identified. These are the type of vulnerabilities that we have identified so far and what type of attack vector we see from it. But then we have also phase 2, which is the actual engagement, right? Which is the reconnaissance, the exploitation, and the reporting. When we look at reconnaissance, this is of course something that is done through most likely scanning, but it can also be through open source intelligence. It really depends on the situation. OSINT is most likely more applicable when it comes to external attacking. When it comes to exploitation, it is important to show a good proof of concept when it comes to exploitation steps. So if we identify a vulnerability, and then we need to start looking at, okay, how are we going to show how this vulnerability works and what are the precautions for this vulnerability? And this is of course written down and conducted in the report itself, step by step, and what remediation actions, what we deem the severity level to be, etc. Right. We also have the reporting part, which summarizes all of these actions and information regarding identified vulnerabilities. There's also a debriefing meeting where we talk about potential concerns that have been raised, if there is some ideas that have been that has come along the way, if there is something that needs to be brought up, or maybe something needs to be made clear in the report. And that extra step is there to kind of clear everything up, and if there's any questions that we can talk about, or if there's anything that we need to show and kind of talk about a little bit extra, we can do that there. We have what we call a scope definition, which is a scope established between Onevinn and the customer during initial meetings. This is going back to, okay, what are we going to test? The scope definition can be either for external or internal testing. It's for both of them. But optimally, it should be divided into two categories, which are in scope and out of scope. Of course, if you only want something that is in scope, let's say one domain, then we can just do that scope. We don't need to do all of the other ones which are out of scope. But it's basically the in scope is where entities such as domains or IP addresses that we want to test, and the out of scope assets are the items that should not be interacted with or tested upon. So what does this type of penetration test scope looks like? Well, we can have an in-scope object that is, for example, api.example.com. We can have idp.example.com. So we can have subdomains. We can also have IP addresses, of course. But we can also include out-of-scope objects like admin.example.com or like prod server if there is some vital part of production that we cannot test because we cannot risk downtime. Then it should most likely be done in a development or a staging area where we don't work towards a production environment. So that shouldn't be the concern when it comes to scope. When looking at time management and assumptions, we set the time frame for assignments. It is important that we have workshops regarding what the application is, what the functionalities are, and depending on, of course, network scale and other things, we need to sit down and have a chat regarding how we see time management and assumptions being made regarding, okay, how fast or what time frame do we see our testing taking place in? It could vary depending on complexity, of course. But we have, for example, a general example here where we have testing done between the 10th and the 22nd, and then of course we can have a meeting regarding this domain, and then we can have update meetings for each of these steps. This will ensure that we actually have debriefing meetings for each part of the scope, and then we'll see if we miss anything or if any concerns are raised regarding vulnerabilities that have been identified. When looking at the meetings and the debriefs and the reporting, it is important, I elaborate on that as well, that we have meetings during the execution period of an engagement so that the vulnerability discovery updates are pushed as soon as possible so that we can, if there's something that is deemed more important than other things, then we can take a look at that. The reporting part is, of course, a important deliverable where discovered vulnerabilities and security oversights are put in a report and documented. Vulnerability information and exploitation process is also included in there. We have impact analysis and, of course, recommended actions and remediations. When it comes to debriefs, we have, of course, the key aspects of report or any concerns that have been raised. And of course, a nice chat regarding questions or anything that might have been raised. Okay, so during a penetration test, we have different categories. We have, of course, we have the web application, we have network testing, etc. But we also have subcategories like black box and white box, which can be applied to these top categories. So let's say we would want a black box web application test. That would mean that we get no prior insight into the application's source code or anything like that, or any. Basically, we're taking the stance of a real threat actor that has no real insight into how the application works, maybe no workshops with the developers regarding how the backend works or anything like that. When it comes to white box, it will most likely decrease the time in which a security test will take, as we will have meetings regarding application functionality and we'll get insight into how the backend works and how everything works. This is, of course, applicable to networks as well, where questions regarding where we're supposed to move in a network, etc., and how this works. So moving on from penetration tests in general, if we have any questions regarding penetration tests, you can put it in the Q&A and then I will have a look at it once we're done with the presentation. Red teaming at its core is the simulation of a known threat, targeting an organization through characteristic means, establishing the effectiveness of processes, technologies, and people utilized in protecting that organization. So putting that blatantly, it's basically obtain a comprehensive cybersecurity assessment that will measure your company's ability to identify and respond to real-world threats. This is kind of where the adversary simulation part of red teaming comes in, because we want to simulate a real-world threat actor on your organization. In doing so, we might raise important questions that the organization might have regarding how security processes and people utilized in that process is done to a more effective way. For example, if we have an attack that is going on, a real incident, time's of the essence, of course. Through early detection, companies can, of course, mitigate the impact of that incident, and that is what we're trying to do with red teaming. We're trying to simulate a real threat actor, and then improve that detection capability, improve all of those processes and technologies to get a good security posture. We also have similar solutions at Onevinn, which is not really a part of security testing, but I wanted to raise it here as well, which is focused on cyber attack and crisis management emulations, which is kind of a form of a tabletop simulations. If that is something that is interesting, you can of course contact Jakob Hellstrand or Stefan Schölling for more cool information regarding that. So I talked a bit about what adversary simulation is. To do some type of simulation, we need the background facts for it. As a big part of red teaming is adversary simulation. It's basically, when we talk about simulating an adversary, it's talking about the threat actor's mindset and the methodologies, the tactics they use once they are either to compromise an environment or move laterally within an environment. So who are the threat actors that we see? Well, we can look at smaller groups, of course, and APTs. We can look at old school criminals moving towards IT-related crimes. And of course, curious teenagers. Can never overlook the curious teenagers. So basically, through various sources, we have, of course, our in-house cyber threat intelligence, like obtaining operational tactics from the recent Conti leak is a good source of information when it comes to how ransomware actors both exploit and move within an environment and how they actually conduct their ransomware attacks. But we also have frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, which gives us a lot of data regarding how which tools specific threat actors use, how they use them, what industries they target, etc. Here's an example of what that panel looks like, or the website. This is, of course, something you can go to and look at yourself. But here we can see different groups and a general description regarding what this tool is, right? But if we're interested in APT28, for example, we can have a look at that, and it will give us a general description about that group. On this page, you can also get more information regarding tactics and techniques used by APT28. If there is a threat, let's say if APT28 is a threat actor that is targeting an industry that an organization works within, then it might be relevant to simulate APT28's movements and their techniques. So talking about the TTPs, which is tactics, techniques, and procedures, we can talk about tactics representing the why. So why is something conducted? Techniques represent the how an adversary achieves a tactical goal by performing an action. And the procedures detail known implementations of a particular technique. So it implements of a particular how, basically. So looking at how adversary or why adversaries do it, basically, we can look at reconnaissance. The big parts are reconnaissance, initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, lateral movements, and exfiltration. I believe those are the two big pillars that you need to look at. Then we have, of course, the other ones that are important as well. Don't take me wrong, but these are the ones that we look at initially when classifying a threat actor. Then we have the techniques representing how an adversary achieves a tactical goal, which is basically if someone wants to circumvent to do some type of privilege escalation, we can see how they use that, maybe through exploiting a wrongly set UID bits or bypassing user account controls or some type of pseudo misconfiguration. So when it comes to red teaming and the assessments that we do have, one of them is the internal assessment. An internal assessment is a more time and cost-effective operation where we as attackers are given initial access and therefore eliminating the process of gaining access. This method follows up in combination with the assume breach. Like earlier, we talked about we don't need to do the initial steps of actually gaining access to the environment. A red team where we get the internal assessment is maybe a situation where we get a laptop with VPN access or something like that, where we get the internal access before actually having to do any external reconnaissance. When it comes to external assessments, it takes more time to conduct, but it's just as important to assess the external security posture. These two vary. If we believe that external assessment is more important for our current organization, then that is something that we need to do first. If we believe that our external security posture is good, then we might want to have a look at our internal security posture. So this really depends on the situation that you are in and is something that might be brought up during a meeting and discussed. So if we look at a typical red team and the external assessment, we can look at a timeline where first we perhaps define a scope. Is there specific buildings that we're supposed to look at? What are the IP addresses, etc.? We will of course have to outline operations, what we call a rules of engagement, where we list ethical concerns. It will include everything that is allowed to be done and allowed methods. We have what we call a definition of done, where we define what goal we want out of the operation, what we want out of the assessment. We have the OSINT step. Now is where we start our real engagements, where OSINT stands for open source intelligence, where we're starting to look at gathering information that is publicly available. So no real active scanning towards a domain or target or anything like that. Just general information on the internet. We then move forward with perhaps a physical engagement as well, where we conduct wireless testing, perhaps against office buildings or something like that. We conduct social engineering attacks. If that is successful, we might look at perhaps installing a Linux box behind a TV or something with an Ethernet connection. Access analysis, see what type of access we have from that initial breach. Verify if we reached a definition of done, if we have reached a goal that we have set. But if we go back to the step here, then we have, of course, the data that we have collected from our open source intelligence is then processed and summarized. We can then start our campaign and utilize the information that we have gathered to establish an entry point. We have then another access analysis where we go through kind of what access do we have? Where do we need to move? What type of access can we get out of this environment? And then when we reach our definition of done, reporting starts, and then of course presentation. Here we have kind of an example of an external attack. If we look at it, for example, we have a victim that opens an attachment. We have an attacker that sends an email to a user on the inside. We have the internet boundary here. Emails are a great way of just bypassing this. That's why phishing is extremely effective and still one of the most common initial access points that we see. In that email, there was a document that the victim downloaded. That document has a malicious macro within it that runs PowerShell and downloads malicious code from the internet. This also means that the attacker has remote access to this victim. But on this computer, we've had a help desk user that uses high privilege account, for example, domain admin that is logged onto this computer. By doing this, the attacker can then grab credentials from this victim machine and authenticate against the domain controller. So that is one way of doing it. Kind of an interesting scenario to think about, and yeah. As I was talking about the physical assessment before that we saw in the timeline, it is a physical security test to identify weaknesses in the established physical infrastructure. This is of course related to the physical infrastructure as in people as well, not just gates and security cameras and things like that, but physical testing adds that little extra vector of the attack that could identify risks associated with the flaws that are currently implemented or the procedures that might not be implemented. This includes a range of attacks like social engineering or exploitation of bad security protocols. We will be looking at Wi-Fi. We will be looking at people and processes. Another assessment that we have is, of course, the phishing assessment, as it is still one of the most common initial access vectors. But phishing is categorized as a social engineering attack, where an actor conducts attacks against a target through the use of social media or email services, and is often accompanied with malicious code or credential harvesters. So the goal of this is to conduct mostly phishing campaigns in order to collect data that will serve as a measurement of an organization's resilience to these types of attacks. Specific data that is collected can then be applied to a report, basically highlighting areas of weaknesses that we see, or used in structuring mostly educational materials that can be provided to the company, which will help prevent or mitigate the impact of phishing incidents. Here we have a little demo of a malicious email being sent, and if we have credential harvesters, for example, or those little copies of maybe Facebook or something that you've seen that you're supposed to put in your credentials, and then your account gets a password reset and you can't log in again. We have, of course, browser exploitations and code executions as well. There's top 3 malicious emails. But we have a bunch of phishing types that some of you might know, and some of you might not know. Regarding just the general one, which we saw here, which is kind of the browser exploitation, credential harvesters, and code execution through a malicious email, which is kind of a wide scope of attack, right? We have no real user set. We have no real targeting. this is kind of the normal phishing that we see that is wide in scope, not really specific to you. It might not mention anything that you deem to be private information or something like that. Spear phishing, on the other hand, might be leaning into that area where a attacker might have investigated or looked at LinkedIn, Facebook, done his or her research basically on you as a person, and then might send an adapted email to that with some type of malicious content in it. Then we have whaling, which is a fun word regarding targeting more higher ups in companies like CEOs, etc. But still using that narrow scope, right? Then we have more phone targeted things where it comes to vishing and smishing. Both where vishing is more of a social engineering attack where you can talk over the phone and kind of convince someone to maybe do something, because it's a lot easier when to trust someone when you're talking to them over the phone. Can vary in scope. This can be applied to different aspects of an organization. But a good example is, of course, account resets with the help of a company's technical support. Smishing is more text communications. We have, of course, seen multiple texts from a SMS telling us that maybe a package has arrived in your name and you're supposed to click on a link. This was a popular one and probably is a still popular one that people send. So what is the difference between red teaming and pen testing? Red teaming is more focused on adversary simulation. So we can look at what type of adversaries are active in the industry that you are in at the moment. What are their tactics? How do they conduct their strategies? What can we do to prevent these types of attacks or help organizations detect and get the right processes in place to detect these types of adversaries? Red teams are primarily used to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of the processes and technologies and peoples within it. We want to increase and do a resilience evaluation regarding the current situations, and then of course afterwards when we're done. Penetration tests are more systematic security evaluations. They are not focused on acting like an adversary. It's purely evaluations focused on identifying vulnerabilities in systems or applications. It can be purely looking at what type of business impact the vulnerability has, but also provide a good proof of concept for discovered vulnerabilities. It's also more focused on framework. It's not really that adversary work that we do when it comes to red teams. It's more structured in that manner that we have a set line of work that we need to be doing. But adversary simulation is more of a fluid movement and can be changed more freely. We also have a simpler one, which is the vulnerability assessment, which is a solution that utilizes the vulnerability assessment tools to identify, evaluate, and report on security weaknesses. So in theory, it's in practice, it is someone who is sitting and evaluating through tools and manually, looking at what type of vulnerabilities we might identify on devices, and then reporting on those vulnerabilities that have been identified. And this is, of course, something that will help with patch management and things like that, what we can consider to be most important. Discovered vulnerabilities will be given threat scores and remediation actions and etc. We have, of course, a training and education platform as well, where we talk about different solutions when it comes to offensive security courses. We have presentations, we have corporate education packages, we have awareness training, and of course, offensive security courses. For example, an OffSec presentation is maybe a webinar or a presentation that is 1 to 4 hours. It can talk about mostly anything, but for an example, it could be how threat actors attack organizations or any other topic that we agree upon. Corporate education, kind of that education package, could be some content to contribute to increased security awareness. For example, how does malicious code work? How does phishing work? How do we identify phishing? How does password attacks happen? How do we handle our passwords? For the courses that we have fun courses that go with access to hackable infrastructure and challenges that we can apply the learned skills that we have taught in the courses that we have. We can see some of the topics that we have available to go through. This is of course adaptable to a curriculum if that is set for schools, but if it is for corporations, we can do the same where we get a list of things that we want to teach, and then we can of course go through those. So how do I know which service is suitable to my organization? Because there is quite a lot of services. We have, of course, from training and education, vulnerability assessment and scanning, penetration tests, red team, and finally, of course, purple teaming. It all comes down to how we perceive our cyber maturity and looking at what type of building blocks do we have and what building blocks do we need. For example, if we have an organization that lacks a blue team, we might not be looking at a red team directly because you might not benefit from all the deliverables that a red team has. If we have a certain application that we might want to push, then penetration test towards that application might be a good idea. Have we not conducted vulnerability assessments or scanning before? Then this might be more interesting. If we're just interested in scanning, in awareness training and looking at how we can prevent users from clicking on phishing links, then training and education might just be the thing for you. It all comes down to what we've done before and what type of building blocks we want to build. So if we could take some key takeaways, it's correctly applied security testing solutions should contribute and will contribute to an increased security posture. We will increase threat actor resiliency and improve our attack surface reduction. Thank you. We're now open for any questions that we might have.
Thank you, Victor, for that presentation. I think it was really good. And I guess you pretty much explained everything because there was not that many questions. But I think
there might be questions afterwards.
There might be questions afterwards, and we'll mention that and just reach out to us at Onevinn if you have any questions afterwards as well, and we'll answer them. But I think it's really important to see the difference between the assessments of the internal and external, and as you mentioned as well, what's actually suitable for an organization. It depends, as you say. But start building it and with the training and education and get the feeling of maybe doing small assessments in the beginning to see where are you most vulnerable and looking at the process, as you mentioned, people, process, tools. I think you covered it all.
Thank you again for coming in and having a look at our presentation. We're always grateful.
Yep, and I think we'll end there and give the people 10 minutes back of their time, and thank you very much.